Whichever country comes out on top with regard to this international conflict is going to have ownership of the waters within 200 miles of the island chain. So it's less about the islands physically and a lot more about the international maritime law that governs the waters surrounding those islands.
That story is coming up later in our program. You're listening to Asia News Weekly, a digest of some of the biggest stories from the Asia-Pacific region. Investigators try to piece together what happened to flight MH17. Is a new Cold War brewing in Asia? And Korea struggles with the Sewol tragedy. These stories and more are coming up on the August 1st edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to Asia News Weekly. I'm Steve Miller. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and let's kick things off with some of the major updates surrounding the ongoing investigation of the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. While the bodies of those that perished finally made their way home, the challenge of determining what happened to the plane some 10,000 meters high has begun. It's no easy task, given the crash site is currently controlled by pro-Russian rebels, the same ones that are actually accused of shooting down the plane. The debris field is also said to stretch out some 8 to 10 kilometers. If that's not bad enough, what makes the situation worse is that there's continued intense fighting nearby. Quote, "There is fighting going on. We can't take the risk," said Alexander Hug, the Deputy Chief Monitor of the European security body Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE. Hug continues, "The security situation on the way to the site and on the site itself is unacceptable for our unarmed observer mission," he told reporters. Now, last weekend, Malaysian investigators were able to go on the site, and they said that they were quite happy for the access that they did receive. Whatever did happen to MH17, the experts observed that the heat from the impact was so intense it actually melted the wings. Spokesperson for the Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, Michael Bosi-Urku, explained that this was due to the wings of the 17-year-old Boeing plane being made out of aluminum, as opposed to composite material more commonly found in newer planes. When asked if there had been any recovery of parts that supported a missile strike, Bosi-Urku said Ukrainian officials who were there had previously found what they were looking for, and the materials had been sent back to Kiev. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak met with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte to discuss how to secure full access to the site. Najib did help arrange a deal with separatist leaders to secure the return of the victims' bodies and the aircraft's 2 black boxes. Quote, "My priority now is to ensure the third part of the deal is honored, and that international investigators are given full and secure access to the site," Najib said in a statement. "It will be an international effort to secure the site, spearheaded by the Netherlands, and may be joined by up to 100 Australian officers. Of paramount importance is securing the site for proper analysis. The team doing that will be made up from members from the Ukraine, Malaysia, Germany, the United States, Britain, Russia, and the International Civil Aviation Organization, or the ICAO. Those black boxes that were recovered do appear not to have been tampered with, and that's a very good sign, meaning that other important information needed to glean who is actually responsible for this shooting might still be located." So what did these black boxes say? Well, Ukrainian officials say the data indicates the reason for the destruction and crash of the plane was a massive explosive decompression arising from multiple shrapnel perforations from a rocket explosion. While these developments are on the ground, political fallout continued across Europe. European Union ambassadors met last week and voted to extend Ukraine-related sanctions, targeting top Russian intelligence officials and leaders of the pro-Russian revolt in eastern Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry vehemently opposed these measures, saying it would undermine efforts to curb terrorism. The White House added that European leaders, quote, "agreed on the importance of coordinated sanction measures on Russia for its continued transfer of arms, equipment, and fighters into Eastern Europe." They also agreed to press Russia to end its efforts to destabilize the country and instead choose a diplomatic path for resolving the crisis. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, said earlier this week in a statement, "The horrendous shooting down of the aircraft on July 17th was a violation of international law that may amount to a war crime. She called for a prompt, thorough, effective, independent, and impartial investigation. When it's time to prosecute those responsible, Ukraine and the 11 countries who had passengers on board will form a joint team to carry out the task. As much as the world focuses on what happened and why, we mustn't forget the families who lost their loved ones. Last weekend, some bereaved family members made the pilgrimage to the crash site. According to reports, a truce was called in the immediate area, but loud explosions were still heard only 60 kilometers away. Angela Rudhart-Jasinski made the trip hoping to make sense out of the loss of her daughter Fatima. She and her husband, who wore a t-shirt with the words, "Fatima, we love you," were overcome with emotion as they walked among the wreckage and scorched earth. Ultimately, they did place a large bouquet of flowers on part of the debris field. For ongoing updates throughout the week, be sure to follow Asian News Weekly on Facebook and Twitter. In just a little bit, how the Sewol tragedy still affects Korea. Over the past week, a war of words has been unleashed between China and Japan. Both assert the other is causing regional instability, while at the same time building up their respective militaries. Joining me now is Asian News Weekly's regional policy expert, Anthony Murphy. Anthony, can you do me a favor and set the current regional stage between these two powerhouses?
So what we have here is Japan and China engaged in a very hot contest over what's called the Senkaku Island chain. China has come to the international community with claims to the Senkaku Island chain based on historical precedent. So specifically, fishermen saying that my grandfather has fished these islands for XYZ number of years, or that my cousins took refuge from hurricanes here or typhoons here. Among these island chains, and therefore China should own and control these island chains. Well, it has a lot less to do with historical precedent as they're putting it forth like that, and a lot more to do with international maritime law. You see, according to international maritime law, any country that owns a land feature in the water is also subject to ownership of any features within 200 miles of that land feature. So, for example, underwater oil deposits. And that's really what's at stake here. Underwater oil deposits, fisheries, etc.
Right, and Japan this past week actually released a whole bunch of historical documents, and they basically assert that the Senkakus were uninhabited islands that were used as navigational markers for seafarers traveling between the Ryukyu Kingdom and China, and that China never really claimed the islands as any of their territory. Does this mean that Japan has a better claim?
It doesn't necessarily mean that Japan has a better claim. You see, this is all getting back to the historical ownership. And historical documents at the time were very dubious at best. The sources can't necessarily be verified. Even if they could be verified, what does it necessarily matter that 2 or 3 fishermen took residence on these otherwise abandoned island chains? Again, what's really at stake here is whichever country comes out on top with regard to this international conflict is going to have ownership of the waters within 200 miles of the island chain. So it's less about the islands physically and a lot more about the international maritime law that governs the waters surrounding those islands.
Speaking of conflict, Japan recently just reinterpreted their Article 9 to allow for a more active role in terms of collective self-defense. And China has said that this military buildup is cause for worry in the region, but China itself has developed new high-altitude missiles and has been conducting drills in the area.
Let's look at the situation from China's perspective. About 1 year ago, August 6th of 2013, Japan unveiled the largest destroyer-class ship that they have ever produced since World War II. It's the Izumo-class helicopter destroyer. Now, officially speaking, they use this for border patrol anti-submarine warfare. So it's part of the JMSDF, that's Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. So officially speaking, they're going to use it to patrol their borders and as part of national defense. But the problem from China's perspective is that this vessel and ones like it are technically capable of launching fixed-wing aircraft. And that becomes a problem because of, as you said, Japan's reinterpretation of their constitution. Their constitution strictly prohibits offensive military equipment, i.e., aircraft carriers. And if you've got a vessel that is technically capable of launching and landing fixed-wing aircraft, you've got an aircraft carrier which is classified as an offensive military vessel. The Japanese Defense Agency chief Tsutomu Kawara is quoted as saying the self-defense forces are not allowed to have ICBMs, that's intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers or aircraft carriers, and he goes on to argue that this Izumo-class destroyer does not constitute an aircraft carrier because it carries only helicopters that are used for submarine destruction and intercoastal waterway defense of Japanese mainland. So that's coming at it from the Chinese perspective. From the Japanese perspective, the China's People Liberation Army Navy has increased dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. The amount of money and personnel that China has been pumping into their navy is unprecedented in the country's history since World War II. So Japan is very, very concerned about this. A lot of other Southeast Asian countries are very concerned about this as well, which ties into U.S. involvement in the region. But from their perspective, it's very, very important to develop strategic capabilities to counter a potential conflict in the region. For example, the U.S. Department of Defense just recently announced plans to develop a new coastal water naval vessel in concert with China as a specific response to the growth of China's People's Liberation Army Navy.
Do you think that we could potentially see a Cold War arms race in the region?
I definitely think that is a very real potential possibility. You see, as China grows more and more powerful, specifically within this region, they are pushing for bilateral engagements with other countries. And what that means is China, for example, if China engages in negotiations with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, what bilateral means is that they want to be the only parties involved, China versus Japan. They don't want the U.S. involved. It would be to China's detriment if the U.S. were involved, because then Japan would have a very strong ally on their side. So with respect to all of the countries in the Southeast Asia region and in East Asia in general, China's pushing for bilateral approaches now. The United States, as well as most of the other ASEAN organization countries, are pushing for multilateral approaches, because if they do that, they've got the United States on their side. And they can remain relevant in the region economically, militarily, culturally, politically. They can remain relevant as opposed to being subordinated to China.
That was Asia News Weekly's regional policy expert, Anthony Murphy. For more information on this and all of our stories, you can go to our website, asianewsweekly.net, for links located in the show notes. While there, please leave a comment to let us know your thoughts, but also follow us on Facebook and Twitter to get even more information throughout the week. 100 days following the sinking of the South Korean ferry Sewol, thousands gathered in Seoul this past weekend, calling for a special independent investigation into the incident and the botched rescue. The group included some 600 of the victims' families and others who marched for 2 days from the city of Ansan, south of the South Korean capital of Seoul. Quote, "We want Parliament to pass a special law guaranteeing a thorough investigation into the sinking," a leader of the families group told journalists. That measure is currently gridlocked in the National Assembly, with rival political parties bickering over what power the investigation should have. Personally, I'm not holding out any hope that this investigation will return any fruitful information, given the nation spent an incredible amount of money on a nationwide manhunt for ferry owner Yoo Byung-un, even offering a bounty of $500 million, when in fact he was dead and in a morgue since June 12th. That failure led Choi Jung-kyung, the chief of the Incheon District Prosecutor's Office, to submit a letter of resignation to the top prosecution office, effectively ending his 26-year career. Whatever happens in this horrid tale, Choi will be just one of many scapegoats. In fact, Justice Minister Hwang Kyo-an, Prosecutor General Kim Jin-tae, and National Police Agency Commissioner General Lee Sung-han have also been pressured to step down from their posts for failing to capture Yoo. Now, speaking of Yoo Byung-un, the autopsy of his death revealed no specific definitive cause of death, despite the suspicious nature of it. And in some other related Sewol news, Yoo Dae-kyun, the eldest son of Yoo Byung-un, was also arrested recently. He's just one of 3 children being sought in conjunction with the ownership of the Cheonghae-jin Marine Company, not only for being responsible for the ferry disaster, but to pay the damages to the families. The Sewol crew trial is still underway, and some survivors provided testimony in court recently. The actual trial is taking place in Gwangju, but the students involved were sequestered and provided their testimony via video from Ansan. Quote, "There were 30 students queued up along an aisle towards an emergency exit, waiting to be rescued," one student said on the witness stand. The student continued, "With no sign of a rescue team, we jumped into the water one by one. But then a wave swamped the exit, and 10 other students couldn't get out of the ship." Another student said, "The Coast Guard officials were on the rubber boat within an arm's length of the ferry, but they only dragged out people who jumped into the waters. I told them that there were many friends waiting to be rescued near the exit, but they only stared at them." As a result of this testimony and additional information, the captain of Coast Guard Patrol Boat 123, whose surname is Kim, was arrested. Kim is suspected of deleting records from the ferry sinking and entering new information, fearing his rescue team's poor initial response would be disclosed. As a result of all of this, according to a survey conducted by the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, respondents gave the government, the president, and military lower marks from a year ago. President Park Geun-hye's confidence score dropped to 5.44 out of 10, down from 6.21 last year. The confidence score of the government dropped from 5.09 last year to the current score of 4.26. The military score also fell from 5.77 to 4.67. The National Assembly finished unchanged at 2.85. In essence, the people have spoken, and those in charge of Korea have failed and have done so miserably. So where does this leave Korea? Well, quite frankly, not in a good place. Those at the top of the food chain are more interested in protecting their own jobs and hanging others out to dry, rather than implementing the reforms the world knows need to be put in place. Because the nation is remaining fixated on the tragedy and corrective measures aren't being put in place, the gaping wound of the Sewol tragedy remains open. But I have to ask you, what do you think Korea needs to do to set itself right? Please share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. AIDS and sex trafficking is a huge issue in Asia. Coming up later in the podcast, possible ways to reduce them. With tensions rising between China and the rest of Asia, some might think it's a good time for South Korea and Japan to thaw their chilly relationship. Joining me now via Skype from the Cafe Seoul podcast is journalist Eugene Huang. Eugene, what's the latest between Seoul and Tokyo?
Well, they're still on very chilly relations, it seems like, but there has been efforts by the Japanese side anyway to improve dialogue. So the governor of Tokyo, Yoichi Masazoe, came to Korea, and he did a few things. You know, he laid a wreath at the memorial for the Sewol ferry victims, and he did that in connection with the mayor of the city. And then also later he met with President Park at the Blue House, and he wanted to try to get a dialogue between Seoul and Tokyo started, but she kind of didn't say no, but she said, you know, Japan needs to say sorry for the comfort women issue and for other issues that they do. I don't know if she mentioned Tokto, but I'm sure that might have had something to do with it. Basically, every single grievance that Korea has with Japan over history, and basically that serves as a de facto rejection to meet and have more dialogue.
President Park has said repeatedly since she took office that unless Abe and Japan specifically change their view of history and accept their responsibility for all the atrocities during World War II and the colonial period of Korea, that she's unwilling to meet with them. And in fact, this meeting is the first person from Japan who's been to the Blue House in her term.
She doesn't have to really agree because, you know, the ball's in Japan's court to agree to her demands because, you know, Korea's kind of the victim and can play that card.
But is that just a matter of playing up domestic politics in favor of what should be done to provide regional stability?
I think it's advantageous for both sides because they definitely need to get together and start discussing things like this. However, if you can make a wave in Japan-Korea relations, then the people in both countries, the constituents of both Abe and Park Geun-hye, they can say, look, we're trying to meet with you, but you won't do this. You won't acknowledge your historical problems. So how can we meet with you to talk about anything if you still are not seeing history the same way as we are? And then that'll take people's mind off of some domestic issue. Conversely, in Japan, you got the same thing. It's like, oh, we're trying to talk with the Koreans, but they're being really stubborn. So it's not our fault that we can't talk with them. And then that gets people's minds off of maybe the economy or something.
Last week we spoke about the United Nations telling Japan that they needed to use the term enforced sex slaves. And then this week the United Nations has come out and saying that they really need to do more in terms of redressing the issue, making apologies, possibly entertaining the notion of making additional compensation for those women. Do you think that this directive from the United Nations will have any impact on how Japan will view the current bilateral talks between South Korea? And will Park Geun-hye, in your opinion, use that to try and force Japan to meet somewhere in the middle?
Well, I'm sure that President Park will mention that. It's to her advantage to do so, so I don't see why she wouldn't. On the other hand, I don't know that a UN directive like that would necessarily cause Japan to take a different approach to anything, because the UN is kind of toothless. I don't think they can really force Japan to do anything, and it's not really to their advantage to just give Korea what it wants on every single issue. So I do not foresee that they will go into it with a different approach, and also because the administrations of both countries, they kind of need this issue to be drawn out for their own political gains.
Well, thank you very much, Eugene, for your commentary.
Thank you.
That again was Eugene Huang from the Cafe Seoul podcast and a journalist here in Seoul. Don't forget, you can also check out our other podcast, Asia Now. It drops every Monday and Wednesday throughout the month of August. It features stories, conversations, and news taking place in Asia now. I remember growing up in the 1980s, specifically the time period when HIV and AIDS first appeared on the scene. There was a lot of widespread fear. I remember looking back now, the tremendous amount of misinformation that was made available. I remember the impact it had on communities and, of course, the discrimination that ensued. Today, AIDS and HIV are treatable diseases. However, in several parts of the world, it's still a problem. Switching gears to Asia, we look at China. Today, there's less than 0.1% of adults who are infected. However, there are indications that cases are rising. According to official statistics, 800,000 Chinese are living with HIV, but health officials are concerned because there is a rise in HIV transmission, particularly among the young. 70,000 new cases of HIV were identified last year, and the highest rate of increase are among teenagers and young adults. Quote, "What we have seen over the past few years is a quite significant shift where infections are happening," said Dr. Bernard Schwartlander of the World Health Organization, who is a representative in China. He continues, "Whereas initially the majority of infections happen through blood transfusion and blood donation situations and injecting drug use, today the vast majority of cases are transmitted through sexual transmission." Maya Wong of Human Rights Watch says, "The government, on one hand, has been quick to deal with the AIDS crisis through providing access to medical care. However, there are still obstacles. On the other hand, it continues to obstruct efforts and harass activists who try to have an honest discussion on how to control the spread of AIDS." Xiao Gangwei, who organizes an AIDS walk every year in Beijing, says, "There are a lot of problems. There are still people getting fired because they have HIV. People get rejected at school because they have HIV. It's truly a sad situation. Better education is one way to curb AIDS proliferation, especially among those who know little to nothing about the deadly consequences of the disease. But as I said, the majority of new cases in China are being transmitted sexually, and unfortunately throughout Asia there remains the concept of the sexpat, a foreigner who travels throughout the region looking for sexual conquest. It's a phenomenon that has given rise to increased AIDS risks. The 20th International AIDS Conference was held in Australia and was aiming to make a difference. Female sex work is one of the biggest vectors of the world when it comes to the HIV pandemic, and sometimes, unfortunately, they are the bridge between infected drug users and heterosexual men who buy sex from them. One study actually said that eliminating anti-sex work laws would reduce the number of HIV infections. However, that same study also found that if it was decriminalized, sex workers would get more information about safe sex and condoms than they would get access to treatment if they were actually infected. Anti-trafficking advocates also said at the meeting that criminalizing sex work drives the industry underground, making it harder to identify individuals that have been trafficked. So what is the solution to HIV, AIDS, spreading in Asia, and sex trafficking? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that human trafficking just plainly is wrong. It needs to stop. The only way that's ever going to happen is for governments to clamp down, and anyone who is found guilty needs to be put away for a long, long time. Second, we need to check our morals at the door. The fact is, people are going to pay for sex. It's one of the oldest professions on the planet, and as long as the sex is between two consenting adults, who really cares? Do we need to be involved in that business? Sex work is work, and Heidi Fleiss, the Hollywood madam, has certainly proved that. And realistically, once it's labeled as work, well, then you can tax it, both on the sales of sex and the income it provides. And that can be a boon to many countries who are in dire need of a source of revenue. And finally, with sex in the open, you can actually see that all parties get the education and, more importantly, the care that they need. Well, what are your thoughts on prostitution? Is it a moral crime that should be punished? If so, who should be punished? Should it be the prostitute, or should it be those seeking their services? Chime in and let me know. Our last story this week has been one that's been requested numerous times over the past few months, but quite frankly hasn't been worth talking about until now. Now, what am I referencing? Well, it is Seth Rogen's new movie, The Interview. It's caused quite the stir in North Korea, and after all, it is a film about assassinating Kim Jong-un. The DPRK has called it an undisguised sponsoring of terrorism and an act of war. And that really isn't all that surprising. If you recall, on our April 18th episode, we spoke about how an English hairdresser got the intimidation treatment from the North Korean embassy for calling Kim's haircut bad. In fact, he went as far as to put a poster of Kim Jong-un outside his shop saying, "Bad hair day? Well, 20% off all gents' haircuts." So what's happened now? Well, Vice Marshal Hwang Pyong-so said North Korea would launch a nuclear strike against the United States, accusing Washington of increasing tensions on the Korean peninsula. Specifically, the White House and U.S. military bases around the Pacific were targeted, and they said that they would be hit if Washington attempted to undermine North Korea's sovereignty and the right to have nuclear weapons and deploy a nuclear aircraft carrier, both of which they don't have. Now, the United States responded in just the way it needed to, by declining to comment. Now, this entire incident just goes to show how far North Korea is willing to go to get in front of the headlines. This is a completely baseless threat and is nothing more than grandstanding. In fact, when the United States didn't respond, North Korea fired artillery shells off their east coast into the sea. It's just one more pathetic attempt to get attention. Well, my friends, it is time to close out this week's episode, but before I do, let's take a quick moment to hear some of your comments from last week. First up, from Tommy, or at Logan Run on Twitter, he had this to say about the United Nations. I would go with BS talkers, but that's just me. The United Nations is a bunch of hypocrites, so what they say matters little to me. Next up, we have a comment from Frederick Koenig, who agrees with the United Nations and the term enforced sex slave, because the women were forced to be sex workers. And finally, Tochjo772 says South Korea really has no choice but to keep good relations with China, because China has become South Korea's single biggest export market, but also for the fact that China has a lot of influence over North Korea. As far as regional security issues, I believe South Korea is more likely to work together with Asian partners. For example, the Philippines is already making plans to buy South Korea's warships. Thanks again for all these comments. You guys leave some of the most amazing feedback on the interwebs I have ever seen, and I really do value them. But I also value your time, so thank you again for listening to this week's episode. I really do appreciate it. As always, you can download this and every single show from our website, iTunes, Stitcher, and of course TuneIn Radio. And if you really enjoy this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. If you're an iTunes or Stitcher user, I have a really big favor to ask. Could you please take just a few seconds and rate and review the show? It's how podcasts are featured and would mean so much to me. If you have any feedback or questions about the show, including what you like and what you don't, you can always get a hold of me via Facebook or Twitter. Our Facebook page is Asian News Weekly, and of course the Twitter feed is at Asia News Weekly. But if you want to keep things just between you and I, you can also send an email message to asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. Well, my friends, that is it for this week's show. I'll be back next week. So for Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.